250,000 tons of fuel. That is roughly how much the largest oil storage site in occupied Crimea, the Feodosia Sea Oil Terminal, could hold at full capacity. Today, more than half of its 43 storage tanks have been damaged or destroyed. And the story of how that happened is really the story of how an entire peninsula, annexed by Russia over a decade ago, has been slowly cut off from the fuel that keeps its military, its economy, and its civilian life running. This is not a single strike. It is a campaign built up, strike by strike, month by month, and it has quietly become one of the most consequential logistics battles of the entire war. To understand where things stand today, we need to go back and trace how it got here, because the current fuel crisis in Crimea did not appear overnight. It was built. Let's start with the terminal itself, because it is the anchor of this whole story. The Feodosia Sea Oil Terminal sits on the southeastern coast of the Crimean Peninsula, in the city of Feodosia, roughly 250 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. According to Ukraine's general staff, the facility functions as a multifunctional transshipment complex, moving crude oil and refined petroleum products from rail tank cars onto seagoing vessels, and it has been used by Russian occupation authorities specifically to keep Crimea supplied with fuel during emergencies. That detail matters. This was not just another commercial depot. It was, by Ukraine's own description, the backup plan for the entire peninsula. Ukraine has hit this terminal before. Back in October of 2024, Ukraine's military carried out a strike on the Feodosia terminal, which its general staff said was part of a broader effort to undermine Russia's military and economic capacity. Russian-installed authorities in Feodosia confirmed a fire at the site the following morning, though they did not say what caused it. At the time, this was treated as one incident among many, part of a war that, as Al Jazeera reported then, had already ground into its third year with no resolution in sight. But 2025 is when the pattern started to change. According to Wikipedia's aggregated timeline of open source and wire service reporting, and corroborated by Reuters, a substantial escalation in Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure began in the second half of 2025. Reuters reported that Crimea and Russia's Far East were among the very first territories to experience gasoline shortages, as early as August of that year. By September, Reuters was reporting that certain fuel grades were becoming scarce across Russia more broadly, with reduced refinery output driven by the drone campaign, compounding a separate problem: high borrowing costs that were making it harder for private filling stations to stockpile reserves. On some days, according to Reuters sourcing from retailers and traders inside the Russian fuel market, the attacks had cut Russian oil refining capacity by almost a fifth, while also reducing exports from key ports. By the end of September 2025, Forbes was reporting that the fuel problems had worsened quickly and spread well beyond the frontline regions, with rising prices, formal rationing measures, long queues at the pump, and, in some cases, stations running completely dry. Then, in October of 2025, BBC Verify and BBC Russian published an analysis showing that Ukrainian drone attacks had reached a record level that year, with 14 refineries targeted in August alone, 12 in the month before that, and 8 in September. Cumulatively, the BBC found that 21 of Russia's 38 large refineries had been struck since January of 2025. That is more than half the country's major refining capacity absorbing direct hits within a single calendar year. It was in this environment, in October 2025, that Feodosia was hit again, and this time far more seriously. Ukraine's general staff confirmed a strike on the night of October 6th, describing the terminal as the largest oil storage facility in occupied Crimea, capable of holding up to 250,000 tons of fuel supplying Russian forces on the peninsula. The pro-Ukrainian telegram channel, Crimean Wind, reported that the resulting explosion sparked a fire visible from tens of kilometers away. Just days later, on the night of October 12th into October 13th, Ukraine's defense forces struck the same terminal again. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the second strike damaged 16 fuel tanks that had survived the first attack, on top of the tanks already hit initially. A source inside Ukraine's security service told Ukrainska Pravda that drones operated by the SSU's Alpha Special Group and by Ukraine's Special Operations Forces were behind the strikes. Officials estimated that the total volume of petroleum products that could have been stored across the affected tanks was around 193,000 cubic meters. In the same overnight operation, Ukrainian forces also struck a P-18 radar station in Krasnopoliana, inside occupied Crimea, along with other targets in Kherson and Donetsk oblasts, underscoring that these fuel strikes were happening as part of a coordinated multi-target campaign rather than in isolation. By late September 2025, the pressure was already visible in daily civilian life. Russian business outlet Kommersant, citing data drawn from 17,000 gas stations nationwide, reported that around 50% of gas stations across occupied Crimea and Sevastopol had halted gasoline sales entirely. Kommersant identified the Southern Federal District, the administrative region that Russia claims includes occupied Crimea, as among the hardest hit areas in the country, with more than 14% of its stations suspending sales altogether. Now, here is where the story becomes less about a single dramatic strike and more about strategy. Ukrainian open source analysis published by the outlet Frontliner and citing patterns across Ukraine's defense forces operations in 2026 breaks down the Crimea fuel campaign into three distinct links in the supply chain. The first is logistics, the ports, bridges, and ferries that physically move fuel onto the peninsula. The second is transshipment, the sea terminals, including the Feodosia Sea Oil Terminal and the TES Terminal 1 facility in Kerch, along with the Kavkaz port on the Russian side of the strait, where fuel is pumped from tankers onto shore. The third is storage, the depots scattered around the peninsula in towns like Vardiske, Feodosia, Lenine, and Kerch, where fuel accumulates before being distributed onward to military units and civilian stations. According to Frontliner's reporting, striking any single one of these links reduces Russia's ability to supply fuel, but hitting all three simultaneously is what creates what they describe as a systemic crisis, and that is precisely what has been unfolding in Crimea through 2026. The timeline Frontliner lays out is worth walking through because it shows how deliberate the escalation was. The first strikes on Crimea's fuel infrastructure in 2026 were, in their words, one-off incidents. The Vardiska fuel depot was hit on the night of January 8th, followed by a strike on the Azovska fuel depot in March. Starting in April, according to this analysis, Ukraine's defense forces shifted toward regular sustained strikes, with the pace intensifying month over month. By the period from April through June, these operations had become weekly, and at certain points, daily, alternating between strikes on fuel storage sites and the destruction of air defense systems, radar stations, and air bases that could otherwise be used to protect or support fuel logistics. One of those April strikes is well documented. On April 8, 2026, Ukraine's 414th Separate Unmanned Systems Brigade struck the maritime oil terminal in Feodosia again, an attack confirmed both by the brigade's commander, Robert Magyar-Brovdy, and by Ukraine's general staff. Residents in Feodosia reported hearing explosions around 1 in the morning local time, and videos soon circulated online showing fire at what was believed to be the local oil depot. According to the Crimean Wind Telegram channel, at least 2 storage tanks were engulfed in flames, with smoke visible for roughly 10 kilometers. The same overnight operation also targeted a separate oil depot in the village of Vardiska. Local authorities in Feodosia reportedly responded by closing city roads and cutting off water supply in the area, according to Crimean Wind, though the general staff did not provide further detail on the extent of the damage. The following month brought one of the more visually dramatic strikes of the campaign. On June 21, 2026, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that Ukraine's forces had struck energy, logistics, and air defense targets on both sides of the Crimean Bridge overnight. Speaking on Telegram, Zelensky said, and this is a direct quote reported by the Kyiv Independent, that Ukraine's long-range operations had been applied to what he called the occupier's military logistics, oil industry, and air defense. He specifically named 2 targets, maritime oil logistics infrastructure in Russia's Krasnodar region and an oil depot in occupied Kerch. The operation, according to reporting from the Kyiv Independent, was carried out jointly by Ukraine's security service, its unmanned systems forces, defense intelligence, and special operations forces, hitting targets roughly 300 kilometers from the front line. The TS Terminal 1 to discern one oil terminal in Kerch, one of the key fuel transshipment and storage hubs for Russian forces in occupied Crimea, was hit and set ablaze. On the Russian side of the strait, the Kavkaz port on the Chushka Spit in Krasnodar Krai was also struck, triggering a large fire there as well. Ukrainian sources also reported that 4 radar stations belonging to S-400 air defense systems, along with 2 Panzer short-range air defense systems, were destroyed in the same operation. This particular strike had a human cost that needs to be stated plainly and attributed honestly because it came from Russian-installed officials rather than Ukrainian sources. According to Al Jazeera, citing Crimea's Moscow-installed leader Sergei Aksionov, at least 4 people were killed in the drone attacks on Crimea that night, with Aksionov saying at least 28 others were wounded. Separately, local authorities in Russia's Krasnodar region said a Ukrainian drone attack on an oil transport facility there killed 1 person aboard a passenger ferry and set an oil terminal on fire. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed that 239 Ukrainian drones were shot down over the course of that single night, a figure that comes from Russian military sources and has not been independently verified by outside journalists. It's worth noting, as Al Jazeera did in its own reporting, that Ukraine has increasingly intensified drone attacks on Crimea in this period, targeting the peninsula's supply routes directly, and doing so just as the summer holiday season was beginning, a season the local tourism economy depends on heavily. Just 2 weeks after that, on the night of June 22nd to 23, Ukraine's defense forces struck the railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal near the town of Rozdoln, according to frontliners reporting, cutting off what had been one of the peninsula's key logistics arteries. This is a detail that tends to get lost in coverage focused only on the dramatic oil terminal fires. But logistics analysts consider it just as significant, because it closes off an overland route that had been used to move fuel and other supplies onto the peninsula by rail. By early June 2026, the on-the-ground effects were unmistakable, and were being reported directly by wire service journalists present in Crimea. CNN reported that drivers in Russian-controlled Crimea were dealing with gasoline rationing, based on accounts from Reuters witnesses and local officials. Sergei Aksyonov confirmed that limits had been placed on sales of AI-95, the most commonly used gasoline grade on the peninsula, and that residents would now need fuel coupons to make purchases. In Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea and the traditional home base of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, Reuters witnesses described long queues forming at filling stations. That same month, RFE-RL, reporting independently, described gas stations across occupied Crimea facing what it called worsening fuel shortages, with long queues, formal rationing, and voucher-based distribution systems confirmed by residents on the ground. And by late June, Sergei Aksyonov and Mikhail Razvozhayev, the Kremlin-appointed heads of Crimea and Sevastopol respectively, declared a state of emergency. According to reporting from the Moscow Times, though notably, officials did not specify how long the declaration would remain in effect. What makes this moment different from earlier fuel disruptions is worth pausing on. Crimea had already faced gasoline shortages once before, back in the fall of 2025, when drivers waited for hours in lines outside filling stations across the peninsula. But, according to residents interviewed by the Moscow Times in late June 2026, by this point there were actually fewer lines forming at stations than there had been during the earlier crisis. That might sound like an improvement, but residents explained the real reason. Gasoline was simply no longer available to most private motorists at all. According to those same residents, fuel supplies were now being reserved almost exclusively for emergency services, police, firefighters, utility companies, and businesses that held existing supply contracts. In other words, the lines disappeared, not because the shortage eased, but because there was often nothing left to queue for. The Moscow Times spoke with residents whose daily lives had been reshaped by this. One woman, identified only as Yekaterina, described how her young children, ages 5 and 7, struggled to understand why they could not always watch cartoons or play games on her phone, a detail that points to a second related crisis running alongside the fuel shortage, rolling blackouts tied to the same infrastructure strikes. The fuel crisis is also hitting Crimea's tourism sector hard, just as the peak summer travel season was supposed to be underway. Hotel, guest house, and winery owners, along with tour operators, reported a sharp rise in booking cancellations. Maxim, a Crimean resident who rents rooms in a small cottage outside Yalta, told the Moscow Times he did not know how he would save his business. He said he had taken out a loan the previous year specifically to renovate the property, expecting to recoup his costs during the summer season and pay down his debt. Instead, he said he was hoping the declared state of emergency might at least let him freeze his loan payments as a business owner. Now, it's important to state clearly what remains uncertain or contested in this story, because not every claim here carries the same level of confidence, and a responsible account has to say so directly, rather than blur the distinctions. First, on the scale of the national crisis, the Moscow Times, drawing on analysis from energy specialist Sergei Vakulenko, published a piece arguing that Russia's fuel shortages overall remain, in his assessment, manageable, and that the media portrayal of the national crisis has at times been more severe than what ordinary Russians actually experience day to day. According to survey data cited in that piece, only about 6% of Russian respondents reported encountering fuel rationing at all, and fewer than 1% said they experienced it more than 5 times. Roughly half of those cases, according to the same analysis, occurred specifically in occupied Crimea. That is a meaningful qualifier. It suggests that while the acute crisis in Crimea is real and well documented by multiple independent sources, characterizing all of Russia as being gripped by a nationwide fuel emergency would overstate what the data currently shows. At the same time, the same analysis acknowledges that gasoline production in Russia during 2026 is estimated to be roughly 10% lower than in 2025, and that shortages are expected to worsen further through the summer of 2026, and again by the summer of 2027, because Rosstat, Russia's federal statistics service, has stopped publishing detailed refining data, which itself limits outside verification. Second, on casualty figures from Russian installed officials. As noted earlier, deaths and injury counts following the June 21st strikes came from Sergei Aksyonov, the Moscow-installed head of occupied Crimea, and from Russian regional authorities in Krasnodar. These are officials appointed by the occupying power, not independent or neutral sources, and outlets like the Kyiv Independent and Al Jazeera have consistently noted that such figures could not be independently verified by international journalists on the ground. That does not mean the figures are false. It means they should be understood and are being presented here as claims from one interested party rather than confirmed neutral fact. Third, on the total damage picture at Feodosia specifically, while Ukraine's general staff has confirmed multiple strikes on the terminal, and Frontliner's independent analysis estimates that more than half of the terminal's 43 tanks have been destroyed or damaged across the cumulative campaign, no source reviewed for this account claims the terminal has been fully destroyed or permanently taken offline. It continues to be targeted repeatedly, which itself suggests it remains at least partially operational, or is being rebuilt between strikes, something that has not been definitively confirmed by satellite imagery analysis from a named independent source. Fourth, on the broader strategic context, according to the Financial Times in remarks reported alongside Al Jazeera's own coverage, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukraine pivoted its strike campaign toward Crimea specifically after disabling the oil offloading terminal at Novorossiysk on Russia's opposite Black Sea coast. That framing, that Crimea became a secondary target once a major mainland facility was taken offline, is Zelensky's own characterization of Ukrainian strategy, relayed through the Financial Times. And it is presented here as his stated rationale rather than as independently confirmed military doctrine. There's also a broader naval and logistics dimension to this that deserves mention. According to a Ukrainian Navy spokesman, Dmytro Pletenchuk, speaking to the outlet Suspilna and reported by Al Jazeera, Russia had been forced to reroute fuel supplies to Crimea by sea after Ukraine cut off overland routes. Pletenchuk explained that Russia's remaining options had narrowed down to either a land corridor or a sea connection, and that, as far as Ukrainian intelligence understood it, Russia was not using the Kerch bridge itself to move fuel in the volumes it would need. That reluctance has a clear historical basis. Back in 2022, Ukraine detonated a truck bomb on the Kerch bridge, which set alight a fuel train traveling alongside it at the time, a vivid demonstration of exactly why moving large volumes of fuel across that same bridge carries serious risk for Russian logistics planners. Frontliner's analysis adds that the Kerch bridge is now overloaded and has restrictions in place for hazardous cargo, while the ferry crossing at Kavkaz port is, in their words, no longer functioning properly following the strikes on port infrastructure there. Ukraine's defense intelligence agency, known as HUR, had already destroyed a railway ferry called the Slavyanin back in April 2026, according to the same reporting, which further narrowed Russia's sea-based options for moving fuel and other cargo onto the peninsula. There's also a wider energy campaign running in parallel that helps explain why Crimea's fuel problem has been so hard for Moscow to fix through simple substitution. Al Jazeera's July 10, 2026 reporting noted that Ukraine had struck several other energy targets that same week, pursuing what the outlet described as Kyiv's twin goals of starving Russia of both usable petrol and export revenue from oil sales. Ukraine's security service said it struck and set alight the St. Petersburg oil terminal on July 4th, describing it as one of the largest oil product transshipment terminals in the entire Baltic region, with President Zelensky posting video that purported to show the terminal engulfed in flames. According to the same Al Jazeera reporting, Ukraine continued strikes on the Crimean Peninsula through that week as well, destroying 7 Sukhoi aircraft and 2 sheds containing Shahed-type attack drones at the Saki airfield on July 3rd, hitting the Kerch oil transshipment terminal again on July 6th, and destroying 3 hangars at another facility. Separately, Ukraine's general staff confirmed a July 25th strike on an oil refinery in Tyumen, deep inside Russian territory, alongside a July 26th strike on a Chornomor Naftogaz facility near the village of Vnukovo in Crimea. According to the general staff, Chornomor Naftogaz sites are state-owned facilities that Russian authorities use to extract, store, and transport fuel specifically to supply military operations on the peninsula. In that same overnight operation, Ukrainian forces also struck a ground relay station near Chornomorsk, which the military said is used to extend the operational range of Garin and Gerbera-type attack drones. The point here is that the Feodosia and Kerch terminals were never isolated targets. They were part of a wider effort spanning the Baltic coast, the Black Sea coast, and deep into Russia's interior refining capacity, all aimed at the same underlying goal of constraining how much usable fuel reaches the front line and the occupied territories behind it. It's also worth remembering why Crimea specifically carries this much strategic weight in the first place. Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014, and it has served since then as the home base for Russia's Black Sea Fleet, as well as a critical logistics and staging ground for operations in southern Ukraine following the full-scale invasion in February 2022. That military significance is exactly why Ukraine has, in the words of Al Jazeera's reporting, recently intensified drone attacks on Crimea, targeting the peninsula's supply routes, and in doing so, triggering the broader fuel crisis just as the summer holiday season, historically a major economic driver for the region, was getting underway. Serhiy Danilov, a researcher focused on southern Ukraine and deputy director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, told Frontliner that these strikes are having what he described as a genuine psychological impact on sentiment among Crimean residents beyond just the material disruption of not being able to buy gasoline. Frontliner's reporting adds that residents are growing increasingly dissatisfied with Russian occupation authorities as the disruptions continue, though it's worth being careful here. Sentiment among residents living under occupation is difficult for any outside outlet to measure precisely, and this characterization should be understood as drawn from local sourcing and expert assessment rather than from any independently verified public polling. Zooming out from Crimea, specifically, this fits inside a much larger pattern across Russia as a whole. According to reporting from the Moscow Times in early August 2026, fuel rationing measures were in place in at least 56 Russian regions as of that reporting date, based on open-source data the outlet had analyzed. In dozens of additional regions, residents were reporting rapidly rising gasoline prices, closed filling stations, and lines stretching for miles, even in places where local authorities and major fuel retailers were still hesitant to formally impose rationing. Politico, cited in the same body of reporting, said that by the middle of 2026, roughly two-thirds of Russia's regions were reporting fuel supply issues of some kind, a figure that, if accurate, would mean the disruption Crimea experienced first and most severely in 2025 had, by 2026, spread to touch the majority of the country, even if unevenly, and with Crimea remaining the most acute case. Even Bashkortostan, according to the Moscow Times August 4, 2026 reporting, one of Russia's leading producers of diesel and gasoline domestically, was reported to be feeling the effects of this summer's fuel crisis, a detail that underscores how far the disruption has traveled from the frontline regions where it began. That same reporting described how Ukraine's campaign to isolate Crimea and increase pressure on Moscow is, in its words, transforming daily life on the annexed peninsula, a description that lines up closely with the granular, on-the-ground accounts gathered by journalists over the preceding months. One Crimean resident, quoted anonymously by the Moscow Times, summed up the uncertainty many on the peninsula are living with. Asked about the fuel situation and the state of emergency, she said simply that she did not know when this would end. That sentiment, more than any single statistic, captures where things stand as of this reporting. Not a single dramatic knockout blow, but a slow, sustained tightening of the supply chain that has left ordinary residents of Crimea uncertain about basic things, like whether they'll be able to fill up their car, keep their business running through the summer season, or keep the lights on for their kids. So where does that leave the strategic picture? Based on everything gathered here, from Ukrainian military statements, from Reuters, CNN, Al Jazeera, and RFE-RL reporting on the ground, from the Moscow Times interviews with Crimean residents, and from independent Ukrainian analysis published by Frontliner, the picture that emerges is one of a deliberate, multi-pronged campaign rather than a single decisive strike. Ukraine has targeted the bridges and ferries that move fuel physically onto the peninsula. It has targeted the transshipment terminals, Feodosia and Kerch's TES Terminal 1 chief among them, where fuel changes hands between ships, railcars, and storage tanks. And it has targeted the storage depots themselves, at Vardiske, Semikholodiansk, Lenin, and elsewhere, where fuel sits before being distributed to military units and the remaining civilian stations still receiving supply. The cumulative effect, according to multiple independently reporting outlets, has been a documented state of emergency, confirmed rationing with coupon systems, gas stations, reserving what fuel remains largely for emergency services and existing contract holders, and a tourism sector already reporting cancellations during what should be its busiest season. It's worth going back and filling in one more piece of this puzzle, because it explains why Crimea's crisis has been harder to fix than earlier fuel shortages in the region. Frontliner's analysis notes that the Moscow oil refinery, struck twice by Ukrainian forces in June 2026, will not be able to recover before the end of the year. That matters for Crimea specifically because it removes one more potential source of refined fuel that Russian logistics planners might otherwise have leaned on to backfill supply to the peninsula by rail or sea. In a normally functioning supply chain, a shortfall at one refinery can often be absorbed by rerouting output from another. But when refineries across multiple regions are being hit in the same stretch of months, alongside the transport routes needed to move that fuel south, the redundancy that would normally cushion a regional shortage simply isn't there anymore. Similarly, the Semikholodiansk oil depot, struck by Ukraine's Special Operations Forces on June 7, 2026, adds useful context about how deep this campaign reaches into Crimea's fuel infrastructure. According to the Kyiv Independent, the facility sits near the town of Yedikyu in eastern Crimea, roughly 200 kilometers from the front line, and functions as both a fuel storage site and a regional logistics hub. The depot itself has a long history predating the current war entirely. It had been closed since the 1990s, according to the pro-Ukrainian telegram channel Crimean Wind, before the Russian company BK Terminal resumed operations there in 2015, the year after Russia's annexation of the peninsula. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces described the site as being used by occupying forces as a transshipment point for storing and transporting fuel oil, diesel fuel, bitumen, and other petroleum-based materials. In the same overnight operation, drones also targeted the marine oil terminal in Feodosia, which the Kyiv Independent reported includes 7 separate fuel storage tanks, each with capacities ranging between 10,000 and 20,000 cubic meters. Pro-Ukrainian outlet Exelenova Plus reported that satellite imagery from NASA's Fire Information for Resource Management System, commonly referred to as FIRMS, had detected an active fire at the depot following the strike, and that the area of thermal activity, as measured by that same satellite data, continued to expand in the hours afterward. Russia's defense ministry, for its part, said its air defenses had intercepted 95 Ukrainian drones that same night over Russian territory in occupied Crimea and did not report any damage to infrastructure, a claim that stands in direct contrast to the satellite and on-the-ground evidence cited by Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian sources, and one more example of how Russian and Ukrainian accounts of these strikes routinely diverge and need to be weighed against each other rather than taken at face value from either side. Taken together, all of this paints a picture of a fuel network under sustained, compounding pressure rather than a single knockout blow. Feodosia gets hit, and before it can be fully repaired, Kerch's TES Terminal 1 gets hit. The Kavkaz port ferries get disrupted, and weeks later the Rozdoln railway bridge that offered an overland alternative gets destroyed too. A refinery in Tyumen gets struck, and so does one in Moscow, removing potential backup sources hundreds of kilometers away from Crimea itself. Every time Russian logistics planners might otherwise reroute around one bottleneck, another one has already been created somewhere else in the chain. That is, according to every named source reviewed for this account, the actual mechanism behind Crimea's fuel crisis. Not one dramatic explosion, but dozens of them, layered on top of each other across nearly a full year. To be fully transparent about where this account draws its facts from, reporting and statements referenced throughout came from Ukraine's General Staff of the Armed Forces, Ukraine's Security Service, its unmanned systems forces and special operations forces, and public remarks from President Volodymyr Zelensky. On the journalism side, this drew on reporting from the Kyiv Independent, Reuters, CNN, Al Jazeera, RFE-RL, the Financial Times, Forbes, the BBC, and the Moscow Times, along with open source analysis published by the Ukrainian outlet Frontliner, and aggregated timeline data drawing on Wikipedia's sourced summary of the broader Russian fuel crisis. Statements attributed to Russian installed officials, specifically Sergei Aksyonov in Crimea and regional authorities in Krasnodar, along with claims from Russia's Ministry of Defense about intercepted drone numbers, are flagged here as coming from an interested party in the conflict and have not been independently verified by international journalists, a limitation that responsible reporting on this topic has to acknowledge rather than paper over. Similarly, some early details, such as the exact extent of damage from certain individual strikes, rely on pro-Ukrainian telegram channels like Crimean Wind and Exelenova Plus, sources that have often proven accurate in documenting visible fires and explosions through video and satellite-linked evidence, but which are not neutral, state-verified outlets, and their figures should be understood in that context. What seems clear across every source reviewed here is that this is not over. The pattern from January through the summer of 2026 shows a campaign that has only intensified, not slowed, and Frontliner's analysis suggests further targets, including reserve tanks at military units and remaining petroleum storage warehouses that have so far gone largely unengaged, may still be ahead. Whether that continues to escalate, whether Russia finds new logistics workarounds, or whether diplomatic developments change the broader trajectory of the war, is genuinely unknown, and anyone telling you they know for certain how this plays out this summer is getting ahead of the actual evidence. So here's the question worth sitting with. Crimea has weathered fuel disruptions before, back in 2023 after the bridge was first struck, and again in the fall of 2025. Each time, the peninsula adapted, rationed, and carried on under Russian control. This time, the pressure is coming from 3 directions at once: logistics, transshipment, and storage, simultaneously, in a way that hasn't happened before in this war. Does that kind of sustained, systemic pressure actually change the strategic calculus in Moscow? Or does it simply become the new normal for people living in Crimea, another hardship absorbed and endured, the way so many others have been over the past several years? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.